I still remember that day like it was yesterday, the day everything changed between me and my best friend Jake. It was supposed to be a simple afternoon of helping him fix his dad's old Chevy in the detached garage behind his house. The weather forecast had mentioned a chance of snow, but neither of us expected the sudden blizzard that swept through town that January afternoon. We were so focused on replacing the carburetor that we didn't even notice how the wind had picked up outside, howling against the garage's thin walls like a hungry wolf. Let me set the scene for you properly. Jake's dad's garage was this old wooden structure, probably built sometime in the 70s, with that distinct smell of motor oil, rust, and old tools that seems universal to all dad garages across America. The overhead lights were these harsh fluorescents that buzzed constantly, casting everything in a sterile glow that somehow made the space feel both clinical and cozy at the same time. Tools hung meticulously on pegboards, and various automotive parts were organized in labeled bins. Jake's dad was nothing if not methodical about his workspace. I'd known Jake since freshman year of college. We met in Engineering 101, bonding over our mutual hatred of our professor's monotone lectures and impossible pop quizzes. He was the outgoing one, always ready with a joke or a daring idea, while I was more reserved, the planner who made sure his wild schemes didn't end with us in the hospital or jail. We balanced each other out perfectly, and over 3 years, we'd become inseparable. Jake was tall, with perpetually tousled dark hair and these intense green eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. I was shorter, with sandy blonde hair that I could never quite tame and, according to Jake, the most expressive eyebrows known to mankind. We'd been working for hours that day, our hands greasy and cold. The garage had a small space heater, but it was fighting a losing battle against the dropping temperature. I remember checking my phone around noticing with surprise that the signal had disappeared. That should have been our first warning. "Hey, Jake, my phone's dead," I called out, wiping my hands on an old rag. He was bent over the engine, his favorite wrench in hand, completely absorbed in his work. "Probably just the storm," he muttered without looking up. "Reception out here sucks anyway." I walked to the small window, wiping away the condensation with my sleeve. What I saw made my stomach drop. Jake, you might want to see this." The world outside had transformed into a white void. Snow was falling so heavily that I couldn't even see Jake's house, which was only about 50 feet away. The wind was creating massive drifts against the garage door, and I realized with growing unease that we might be in trouble. Jake finally looked up, his expression changing from annoyance at being interrupted to concern as he joined me at the window. "Well, that's not ideal," he said, which was Jake's way of acknowledging a potentially serious situation without admitting he was worried. "Maybe we should try to head back to the house before it gets worse," I suggested, already reaching for my jacket. Jake nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans and leaving dark smudges on the denim. He moved to the side door, the one that led directly outside rather than the main garage door, and turned the handle. Nothing happened. He tried again, putting his shoulder into it this time. The door budged slightly, then stopped. "I think it's frozen shut," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Or there's too much snow piled against it." We tried the main garage door next, but the automatic opener just made a strained humming noise without actually moving the door. When Jake tried to lift it manually, it wouldn't budge either. "Are you kidding me?" I groaned, the reality of our situation sinking in. "We're actually locked in here." Jake stepped back from the door, running a hand through his hair and leaving a streak of grease across his forehead. "Looks that way, at least until the storm passes or someone realizes we're out here." I checked my phone again, hoping for a miracle, but still no signal. Jake's phone was equally useless. We were well and truly stuck. The next hour was spent in increasingly desperate attempts to escape. We tried prying the side door open with a screwdriver, clearing snow from the small window to see if we could squeeze through. We couldn't, and even considered dismantling part of the wall before realizing that would just let more cold in without actually providing an exit. Eventually, we had to accept our fate. We were spending the night in the garage. "Look on the bright side," Jake said, his eternal optimism somehow intact. "At least we're not stuck in the library during finals week. Remember that time?" I couldn't help but laugh. During our sophomore year, we'd gotten so caught up in studying that we didn't notice the library closing. We ended up spending 4 hours locked in until the morning staff arrived, surviving on vending machine snacks, and taking turns napping on the uncomfortable wooden chairs. At least the library had bathrooms, I pointed out, suddenly aware of a new potential problem. Jake grimaced, then gestured to an empty oil container in the corner. Desperate times, my friend. As the reality of our situation settled in, our initial panic gave way to a strange sort of acceptance. Jake found an old radio on his dad's workbench and fiddled with it until we got a local station, which confirmed what we already knew. The blizzard had hit unexpectedly hard, and emergency services were advising everyone to stay put until morning. See, we're just following official advice, Jake said, turning up the small space heater to its maximum setting. And hey, there are worse people to be trapped with. I rolled my eyes, but he wasn't wrong. If I had to be stuck somewhere during a blizzard, having Jake's company made it infinitely more bearable. He had a way of making even the worst situations seem like adventures. As night fell, the temperature in the garage dropped further. We found some old blankets in a storage box, probably kept there for protecting car finishes during work, and huddled near the space heater. Jake's dad also had a small camping stove stashed away, which we used to heat up some water for the instant coffee we found in a dusty canister. It tasted terrible, but the warmth was welcome. Remember that camping trip junior year? Jake asked, blowing on his steaming mug. When it rained for 3 days straight and your tent collapsed? I groaned at the memory. And you insisted we could still cook those steaks even though everything was soaked. Hey, they were only a little muddy, he protested, his eyes crinkling with laughter. And admit it, they still tasted good. Only because we were starving, I countered, but I was smiling too. That disastrous camping trip had somehow become one of our favorite shared memories, one of many adventures that had cemented our friendship over the years. As we reminisced, sharing stories and laughing at our past misadventures, I noticed something shifting in the atmosphere between us. Maybe it was the isolation, the knowledge that we were completely alone and cut off from the world. Maybe it was the way the shadows played across Jake's face in the dim light, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the warmth in his eyes. Or maybe it was something that had been there all along, something I'd been carefully avoiding acknowledging. After a while, we fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds the howling wind outside and the soft crackling of the space heater. I was sitting on the concrete floor, my back against a tool cabinet, when Jake suddenly stood up. "This is ridiculous," he declared. "We're going to freeze if we stay on this floor all night." Before I could ask what he meant, he started clearing off his dad's workbench, moving tools and parts into organized piles on the floor. The workbench was large and sturdy, built to hold engines and heavy equipment. When he'd cleared enough space, he spread one of the blankets across it. "Your 5-star accommodations await," he said with an exaggerated bow. I laughed. "Still better than that motel we stayed at in Colorado." "Low bar," Jake snorted. "Pretty sure that place had actual rats." I moved to stand up, my muscles stiff from sitting on the cold concrete. Before I could fully rise, Jake was in front of me, offering his hand. I took it, expecting just a helping pull, but instead, he gripped my waist with both hands and lifted me bodily onto the workbench. The move caught me completely off guard. Jake was strong. Years of working on cars and playing intramural rugby had given him a solid, muscular build, but the casual display of strength still sent an unexpected jolt through me. For a moment, I was acutely aware of his hands on my waist, the warmth of them seeping through my thin t-shirt. He set me down on the workbench and stepped back, but not before I caught the playful grin that spread across his face. It was a grin I'd seen countless times before, when he convinced me to go skydiving for his birthday, when he talked us into that road trip with no planned stops, when he persuaded me to sneak into the campus pool after hours. It was the grin that always preceded some of our best memories, the grin that I'd never been able to say no to. "What?" I asked, feeling suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "Nothing," he said, but the grin remained. "Just thinking that being trapped isn't so bad with the right company." There was something in his voice, a note I hadn't heard before, that made my heart beat a little faster. I watched as he hoisted himself up onto the workbench beside me, the old wood creaking slightly under our combined weight. "Budge over," he said, shoulder bumping against mine as he adjusted his position. "Your skinny ass doesn't need all this space." "My ass is perfectly proportional. Thank you very much," I retorted automatically, our usual banter helping to diffuse the strange tension I was feeling. Jake laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet garage. "Can't argue with that," he said. And was it my imagination, or did his eyes briefly flick downward as if to verify his statement? We settled side by side on the workbench, shoulders touching, another blanket pulled over our laps. The position was more comfortable than the floor had been, and the slight elevation put us closer to the space heater's warmth. I should have been more at ease, but instead, I found myself hyper-aware of every point where our bodies connected, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, occasionally thigh to thigh when one of us shifted position. Jake seemed oblivious to my sudden awareness, chatting easily about a project he was working on for his mechanical engineering class, gesturing animatedly with his hands the way he always did when he was excited about something. I tried to focus on his words, but I kept getting distracted by other details. The way his 5 o'clock shadow was more pronounced now in the dim light, the small scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood biking accident, the faint smell of his cologne mixing with motor oil and coffee. "Are you even listening to me?" Jake's question snapped me back to attention. "Sorry," I mumbled. "Just tired, I guess." He studied my face for a moment, his expression softening. "We should probably try to get some sleep. No telling how long we'll be stuck here." I nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Sleep meant an escape from the confusing thoughts swirling in my head. We arranged ourselves as best we could on the narrow workbench, lying on our sides facing each other because there wasn't room to do otherwise. Jake pulled the blanket up over our shoulders, his movements careful in the limited space. "Comfortable?" he asked, his face now just inches from mine. "As I'll ever be on a workbench in a freezing garage," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. Jake chuckled, his breath warm against my face. "You've slept in worse places. Remember that time you passed out under the table at Mike's party?" "That was one time," I protested. "And you were right there on the floor beside me. Someone had to make sure you didn't choke on your own vomit." "My hero," I said dryly. But the truth was, Jake had always looked out for me, just as I'd always looked out for him. That's what best friends did. But as we lay there in the dark, the storm raging outside, something felt different. The friendship that had always been so comfortable, so easy, suddenly seemed charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. Or maybe I could name it, but was afraid to. We fell silent, and I thought Jake might be drifting off to sleep. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the discomfort of the hard surface beneath me and the conflicting feelings inside me. Just as I was starting to relax, I felt Jake shift beside me. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, which was unusual for Jake. I opened my eyes to find him watching me intently. "Sure," I said, curiosity overriding my earlier desire for the escape of sleep. He seemed to struggle with his words, another rarity for my usually confident friend. "Have you ever thought about? Have you ever wondered if?" He trailed off, and in the dim light, I could see a vulnerability in his expression that made my heart ache. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on his arm, a gesture of reassurance I'd made countless times before. But this time, the simple touch sent a current through me, and I saw Jake's eyes widen slightly in response. "What is it?" I prompted gently. Instead of answering, Jake lifted his hand to my face, his fingers lightly tracing my jawline in a touch so tender it made my breath catch. Time seemed to suspend as we looked at each other, years of friendship suddenly illuminated by a new light. "I've been thinking," he finally said, his voice low, "that maybe being locked in this garage was exactly what needed to happen." Before I could ask what he meant, he leaned forward and closed the small distance between us. The first brush of his lips against mine was gentle, questioning, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But pulling away was the furthest thing from my mind. Instead, I found myself responding, my hand moving from his arm to the back of his neck, drawing him closer. The kiss deepened, years of unacknowledged feelings pouring into it. Jake's hand slid from my jaw to my hair, fingers threading through it as he pulled me even closer. When we finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "I just never had the courage." "Why now?" I asked, my mind reeling from the revelation that Jake, confident, fearless Jake, had been harboring the same feelings I'd been trying to ignore. He smiled, that familiar grin that had always been my undoing. "Something about being trapped in a garage during a blizzard makes you realize life's too short not to take chances." I laughed softly, the sound mingling with his breath. Always the risk-taker. Only when it matters, he replied, his expression growing serious again. And this matters, Alex. You matter. Hearing my name on his lips, in that tone, sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I pulled him back to me, our second kiss more confident than the first, the newness of it already giving way to a sense of rightness that I hadn't expected. We spent the rest of that night talking in whispers, sharing confessions and fears, kissing in the darkness as the storm raged on outside. We talked about how long we'd each been feeling this way, about the moments when we'd almost said something but lost our nerve, about what this meant for our friendship moving forward. I was so afraid of ruining what we had, Jake admitted, his fingers intertwined with mine. You're my best friend. I couldn't bear the thought of losing that. You could never lose me, I told him, and I meant it. Whatever happened between us romantically, the foundation of our friendship was unshakable. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the snow-covered window, casting a soft glow over the garage. We were still on the workbench, wrapped in blankets and each other, when we heard the sound of a shovel scraping against the driveway outside. Sounds like the cavalry has arrived, Jake said, but made no move to get up. I tightened my arms around him, suddenly reluctant to leave our makeshift sanctuary. Do we have to go back to the real world? Jake propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me with a tenderness that made my heart swell. The real world is where we get to figure out what this becomes, he said, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. I'm looking forward to that part. Before I could respond, we heard a voice calling from outside, followed by the sound of a key in the side door's lock. The door pushed open with some effort, revealing Jake's dad bundled in winter gear, looking relieved to find us safe. Thank God, he said, surveying the garage. Your mother's been worried sick. Cell towers are down all over town. Jake and I scrambled off the workbench, trying to look casual as we gathered our things. I caught Jake's eye as his dad turned to clear more snow from the doorway, and the private smile we shared held a promise of all that was to come. As we stepped out into the blindingly white world, the fresh snow crunching beneath our boots, Jake's hand found mine, squeezing gently before letting go. In that moment, I knew that being locked in a garage during the worst blizzard in years was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Sometimes, it takes being trapped to finally break free. And as Jake and I walked side by side toward his house, I couldn't help but think that some doors closing lead to others opening. Doors you never even knew existed, but that lead exactly where you're meant to go. Total _char_count. 18,862.